This is a loose environment. Get a name tag if you want one. No problem if you don't have one. But get to know your neighbor, talk, socialize. We'll have lunch down at the cafeteria. We'll have our own little section. Get to know people as you exist in the space. Depending on where Ms. Shepherd lands in time-wise, will be whether we have any exchange questions. But feel free to have conversations outside of the presentation time. And then we'll have another wonderful person that I recently mentioned speak about the things after lunch. Just keep in mind, you're going to be community. That's RELC, the letters community, the C's community. So, with that being said, in 1989, directed by Proverbs 31, 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Uche Shepherd started her mission to mankind and for mankind in a troubled world, armed with the words by Carter G. Woodson. The servant of the people, unlike the leader, is not a high horse trying to carry the people to some designated point to which he would like to go for his own advantage. I hope that resonates. I said again. The servant of the people, unlike the leader, is not a high horse trying to carry the people to some designated point to which he would like to go for his own advantage. The servant of the people is down among them, living as they live, doing what they do, and enjoying what they enjoy. That's something I know she's been working on for the last 24 hours. I'm glad that you wrote it and I can read it. And I appreciate you coming to share time.
Thank you. But the first thing we're going to do is loosen up a little bit. From Charleston, we know that words. So everybody, I know some people think they don't speak the native language developed by the Africans. First of all, the language is in various dialogues because of the way we were located in our residencies and also the residencies on the plantations. Many of the plantations were owned by people of different culture, so different dialogues of the language is being shared. I could share with you, and I will give an example of my grandmother's version of telling us something. Say, for instance, we wanted to participate in a group of people and wanted to be with friends, and then they decided that they didn't want anything to do with us. Well, if we went crying to grandmother, she would say, you don't see them eagle flying out of work because you're going to fly and fly. So I know you would understand that. I'm going to give you the version of it, but then I wanted to do that so I can let you know when I'm using the language and using the dialect, I'm using it so that you would be able to understand both the dialect and the meaning of what I'm saying. So when my grandmother said, you don't see the eagle fly out of work particular fly, she was saying, you don't see eagles fly with other birds because eagles don't fly in flocks. So this was her way of telling us it's okay to be by ourselves because we're eagles, we just have to be with them anyway. It didn't really make any difference to us because we knew that we were being rejected. I wanted us to loosen up, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix the language, but I want it as a participatory. So I'm going to share with you some of the words I'm going to use that you're going to need to use too. So instead of myself, we're going to say myself. Now, the language is not a written language. It was not written, but it is phonetic. So when people write the language, they usually write it from phonetics. But instead of myself, we say myself, like M-A-S-E-F. Let me hear you say it. Myself. Myself. Instead of the way I am, you say the way I is. Like A-H. The way I is. So let me hear you say the way I is. The ladies will say, I'm beautiful. I'm beautiful. I'm beautiful. I'm beautiful. The men will say, I'm handsome. I have love myself the way I am. There's nothing I need to change. There's nothing I need to change. I'll always be the perfect me. I'll always be the perfect me. There's nothing to rearrange. There's nothing to rearrange. I'm beautiful. I'm beautiful. And I'm handsome. I'm handsome. So you can tell people that you actually explain to me like you said. The reason why my accent is different is I was actually born on the peninsula in downtown Charleston. So I had no idea that I really spoke the native language simply because the dialects were so different. And when people would come in from the islands, John's Island, James Island, even Oliver, and various areas selling their vegetables, fish, groceries, well, we as children used to come out to the corner. I was born right next on Mars Street, right next door to the corner. And so we would come out on the corner on Saturday mornings to laugh at them and make fun of how funny they were talking. We did not know that we spoke the same language. We didn't understand about dialect. I only went to two schools growing up. I went to Simonton Elementary and Burke High School. I didn't go to an integrated school until I went to Rice Business College. It's when I got my rude awakening. When I went to Rice Business College and I was majoring in the course of clerk general office, one of the things we did was that we had to use the manual typewriter. We typed at least 65 words per minute, and then we took shorthand, speed writing, 120 words per minute. The top 5 in the class were to be hired by, at that time, Bell South, it was AT&T, and then they had just been bought by Bell South. They were still in between really negotiating. So I was the only African American in the class, and among the top 5 that graduated. Well, I want you to know, when I went for my interview at AT&T, all the 4 of my other classmates were hired. They were 1 male and 3 females. They were hired, and I was not. And I was told that nobody would be able to understand me over the telephone. So that was the first blow that I had, because I was so excited. I was living in the housing project in the area where we had all kinds of violence all the time. And it was terrible. We saw people getting murdered as children right there on the streets, right in front of our doors. So to have been able to come out and get out and have the desire to get out of there, and AT&T was like, hey, good money as far as we were concerned. I just saw a way out. So you can't imagine what it was like to have been rejected by them because of my language that I didn't know I spoke. The language was always a powerful weapon. So withholding it was even more powerful, because that means that in addition to not having any identity, because your culture and your name was taken away from you, then not even having your forms of communication was taken away from you. And really, the Africans developed the language because they were being killed for not understanding the commands of the plantation owners. So they had to develop ways of learning the language and developing their own language, and the genius of it. I mean, it's a genius for them to develop a language that is heard and utilized for people all over the world. And the genius of it is that then they develop an inner language within that, where they communicate through songs and dance. It's really difficult for me, being in my late 70s, to see all of these things that I've been wanting to change to make things better for our children, and see such minute progress. And the reason why it's so minute is because we have Euro-Americans who joined the Democratic Party and votes Republican for power. And so when they have the power in making the laws, and we have so few people able to break that barrier, then our children are suffering. So today, We have children who can't compete on any mental level. When I was in Simonton School, our teachers taught us how to compete on every mental level. We got educated, we would be able to go to college from our high school, our elementary school information, because that's how desperate our teachers were to make sure that we would be able to compete on any mental level. When I had joined a group of professional women, and I was the only African American, and one of them was studying she was going for her PhD, so she needed a subject. They decided that I should be the subject. Well, I wanted to be just to belong. I thought it was a big deal. I didn't understand what it was. But I thought it was like, okay. Well, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. You talk about being turned around, the meanness that was meant, the evilness, and there were laughter and everything that was meant to be turned around for me to get all the top psychological tests by the greatest psychological tester in the United States at MUSC, to be the subject matter of Dr. Vince Mosley, one of the greatest top scientists in the USA. And he really worked with me. He taught me how to be able to use my dyslexia and to embrace it, to love it, and then to be able to use it for my good, for my advantage, to be able to utilize my systems, everything. And I tested severely dyslexic. By the time Dr. Vince Mosley was through with me, nobody could tell unless I told you. I went to college, and he worked me all through college. So I graduated on Dean's List twice. Once in human services, the other in business management, because he was still working with me because I was a willing subject. So they thought it was funny to use me for the subject. And I'm telling you this part because I want us to know that God's word is true. He could turn what is meant for evil to good, but you have to have your mind open. You cannot be closed, because if I was closed-minded, I wasn't a part of it, didn't take part in the situation, I wouldn't have been blessed like I have been blessed with my freedom, my personal freedom, the power of being myself and being able to be true to myself. But we have to be open and we have to believe God. So see, my grandmother, they couldn't get me to go to church because I didn't like church people. Church people were just as phony as a $3 bill at one piece to me. They were white on Sundays and during the week. They were other folks. And I didn't want any part of them. And besides, when I be out there jamming on Saturday night, they were out there with me. So, and so I'm just saying, you have to be careful what you do around children. You have to be careful what you say around children, because you are planting seeds in them that even they don't understand the abstractness of it. So they encompass it all, just like your subconscious mind. You can say, I'm going to look at this and I'm not paying attention because it don't mean anything. If you got it, if you put it in your subconscious, you got it. And the worst thing you can do is bury it in a lie. The worst thing you can do is not know what's going on in your mind and your heart. So that's why people come up with things like jealousy and envy and anger. Well, you have to be angry at, so I think anger is a good emotion. But then the things of backstabbing, of hating, disliking the person, not even knowing anything about the person, but you dislike the person for the way they look. You dislike the person because they can say no to you. You dislike the person because the person has decided that they know how important they are to God, just like you are. Nobody is more important to God than you are. You are very important to God. You always these people have died, and you are still here right now in this space. That means that you are a very important person to God. You've got to know that. And you might have to stand alone to know it, and you will move some people out of your environment. And it could be your family members, You know, it could be the flight members, it could be somebody that you have been very close to for all kind of years, and you decided to ignore the red flags so that you would have this human instinct that we have of just belonging and being accepted. So here's what one of the songs grandmas would have me do, and I used to have to dance for her. I never saw my grandmother dance, never in my life, but she taught me how to dance in order to get the treats that I wanted. If I wanted her to add shrimp to the okra soup, if I wanted her to bake me apple pie, then I had to sing and dance in scripture. And she had me because my mother and my grandmother were never formally educated. So my grandmother would have me as the teachers read the Bible to me, teach me how to read the Bible, and then I go back and read it to her. And then she told me, don't come there while people talk in this house. So even my teachers teaching us English, we're not supposed to be speaking our native language. And then my grandmother didn't want me to speak the other language. So it was really something when a young child is 7, 8, 9, that's a lot of pressure, but God, how I appreciate it today. Everything my grandmother taught me, everything I'm about. It's my grandmother, my mother, my grandmother. I mean, I had other family members, but it's just like everything. And I try to encourage the young people, talk to your elders, ask them questions, but I also want the elders to be honest and talk to them. Answer their questions, tell them the truth. The children deserve the truth, but what they have to deal with in this world out here, they need to know the truth. And they need to understand the truth of their being. That God doesn't love anybody more than he loves them. And they need to have opportunities to grow, expand, and really live. So this would be the 100 song. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye land. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is he that hath made us. And not we are ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him and bless his name. So my grandmother knew the value of implanting the seeds in me. She knew the value of, oh, be done. Oh, be done. Oh, be done. Oh, me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my cave and go home to my Lord and be free.
That you're about to hear from, and I was discussing a couple moments ago, is acknowledge this intentional mistelling of history, to paraphrase our conversation, this intentional lack of inclusion in the telling of history. So, one of the things that I was going to impart in this part of the program, if I had not heard from Dr. Israel, which I'm glad I did, because I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'll get to that, thoroughly enjoyed the presentation, sorry. But Benjamin Banneker, who knows who Benjamin Banneker was? What's he most famous for? DC. Designing GC, right? This famous French architect, designer type dude comes, he has issues and problems, and Benjamin Banneker is able to capture and redo the plans for building DC. But he was also a really brilliant guy on his own merit. He wrote almanacs. He looked at agriculture, he invented stuff. But he also was in correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. He wrote letters to Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, and he said, in a nutshell, you can look it up, Black people are human beings. How do we
how do you, being the wonderful, great, grand person that you are, that he was understood to be at that time in America, in the late 1700s, how do you reconcile this? At Thomas Jefferson wrote him back something that was along the lines of, yeah, we know there's great potential, but he's not willing to relinquish what slavery was in that time. That's not what he said, but that's the energy of the letter. It was one response. But then there's another time that Thomas Jefferson corresponds with a guy in Sweden or somewhere, I can't remember exactly. And he's going on about how we got a Negro here that's special. He's different. He's talking about Benjamin Banneker. So this is history, right? It happens at the same time, and there's conversations amongst people that we're not taught. We're in conversation with each other, right? That's a collective history. Benjamin Banneker challenged ideas of one of the founding fathers. And that's not highlighted in our classes and in our courses, in our curriculum. So understand, collective history is something that we need to celebrate more, we need to understand more about, and that's a part of what you're about to hear about from the Underground Railroad perspective. And I want to make sure I get her introduction half right. So, I'll tell a quick story about how I met Dr. Israel down in New Bern a couple of weeks ago with Joelle and Margaret and their parents. Dr. Freddie Parker, one of my mentors, one of my high bar, and he's spoken in the RELC space a couple of times, I believe. But he's someone I hold in very high regard. He told me about this symposium, and it came together really fast, and I was like, well, I got a couple teenagers I want to get down there if I can, and I saw Dr. Israel's name in the program, and I was mentioning to people, I said, okay, she was Dr. Fraser, who's another professor of mine that presented around the same block. And Dr. Parker said, yeah, Dr. Israel, man, she's at Guilford College, she's retired, she's good people, she knows her stuff, and blah, blah, blah. I said, cool, looking forward to it. Because I geek out on history. We go, we spend the majority of the day there, and we get to the part where she's presenting, and I'm so pleased and satisfied with her style and the way she imparted the information. The fact that I'm going to steal one of her lines right now, and don't be mad about it, but you had lunch, so you might be able to sleep. Because she made me. Since it's getting late today, I start to lose people. But that type of connective conversation is what I like, because her and I are in the realm of academia. We spend a lot of time with books and reading and absent the distractions of the world. You actually make this your career, you have to just submerge yourself in all of these works and all of this literature and all of these other historians and their arguments and so on and so forth. But I'm intentional, as I believe she is, that when you hold space with people who don't have this as their everyday life, it is critically important that you communicate it to them in a way that they can receive it. Not that it's done bad, not that she's wrestling with how to better. It is understood how to have a conversation, right? So she's capable of that. She did a wonderful job at this symposium, and I recognized it, and I said immediately, I gotta go meet this lady. And I called her before she left. I said, hey, I'm doing this thing in a couple weeks. It is. She said, sure. And then we didn't get email correspondence right away, and I said, well, I guess I'll be talking about Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Banneker. But fortunately, she responded the other day, and we said, yeah, we're gonna get this thing on social. Without further ado, Dr. Israel is a retired professor emerita from Guilford College in Greensboro. She was also vice president for academic affairs and academic dean. She earned her undergraduate degree in English and a master's degree in African studies from Howard University, located in Washington, D.C. She earned her doctorate in history from Johns Hopkins University. She has been researching the Underground Railroad and how it functioned in North Carolina, how in the area that Guilford College exists, there are Quakers who assisted, there are people we'll never know who assisted, which gets us back to what that collective history thing, where it wasn't just black folks, it wasn't just enslaved folks, it wasn't just Quakers, there were a number of different people who participated in the exercise of granting or helping to grant freedom to people who were enslaved. So, and that's kind of summed it up, but I don't know how to sum it up. So, so she's now focusing a lot on just what I said, people in the Piedmont Triad area who participated in this exercise of conducting the Underground Railroad, how they conducted it, and all that stuff. And I talked to the screen and
That's
just
okay.
sleep mode.
No.
So, without further ado, Dr. Israel, thank you so much for joining us today.
When I heard the young man from high school talk this morning, I thought, you know, when he said it was about slavery, in a way it was. And I thought it might be good for me to introduce something to you about what I've learned about slavery, beginning in Africa, in Ghana, where I visited first time in 1978. Before the Smithsonian provided a grant to the people in Cape Coast and Omina to kind of make the places more tourist friendly for visitors. I went before that when it was at raw state and when there were piles of manure going up the wall from the feces from the people who had been enslaved. And when it was dark and damp and there was no light down in those places. And I went there, well, I didn't go there to see that per se, but as an African American, I felt I should go. And I remembered when I went to both places, the feeling that came over me of what it must have taken for them to resist. And not just physically resist, but emotionally and mentally, not to have a breakdown, a complete nervous breakdown under those circumstances. Horror. It was so horrible, I can't tell you. There were places, for example, in Almina, where the Portuguese really started the transatlantic slave trade, not the English. And the first Africans who were taken from the continent and arrived in the Americas, not in 1619, but in 1530, about there in Brazil. And they were brought by the Portuguese. And so the people there in Almina, the people in Cape Coast and Ghana, couldn't understand why we African Americans would come there and get so emotional. You know, go into those rooms and you could see, you could feel. It was so bad I wouldn't go into the male quarters. They tried to get me to go down this runway of bats were flying over our heads. And it was just me and the guy. There wasn't any flock of people. Understand? It wasn't a big popular tourist attraction. And they said they couldn't understand. They weren't taught in their schools. You know, one of my friends is from Ghana, is here with me today. She could maybe correct me. But at that time, they told me they were not taught about the slave trade in the school. And these old forts, they were thinking about turning them into, they call them the castle, but they're forts. They were going to turn them into like shopping centers, some kind of area for, you know, for commerce. Because this is old stone buildings. They brought these stones all the way from Europe in ships, not from the continent, these granite stones. They brought them all the way and built these huge edifices. And when you go through them, you get this sense, where I live, of the people who were in here and how they must have suffered. They talked to us somewhat about how they put some behind the walls and died. They died. If they tried to resist, they didn't give you any food, they didn't give you any water, they just put you in this room and you died in your screams. And this included the white people who were working for the slave traders. So I want to throw up to you the fact of resistance being fundamental to our culture. It's almost called a culture of resistance. The culture of resistance is just in our culture to resist. Whatever means you can find to resist. And that's what I think is reflected in the Underground Railroad, especially as it existed in the South. More so, I'm from Ohio originally. And of course I heard a lot about the Underground Railroad growing up because our town was one of the places on the Underground Railroad. But the mythology about it was that it started at the Ohio River. In other words, people helping people escape really started at the Ohio River. And those who had gotten that far did so on their own ingenuity, without any help. And you know, there's this image in our heads about people going into the woods, looking for the North Star, right, feeling on trees for moths, etc., etc. Heroically and almost in futility most of the time, trying to find their way north, having no idea where they're going. So when I saw Professor Freddie Parker's work, I got a different idea. And then I actually, to tell you the truth, I started looking at these ads before I knew that Professor Parker had even done any work. So I did the raw work, and you're going to see some of the raw, looking at the ads for microfilm. And these ads were copied in 1903 from newspapers. And so now you see it's almost 120 years later. It's a little bit hard to read them. So I've typed out what they're saying, so you can read them along with me. And as I read these ads, I was struck by the fact that most of the people who were running away had clothes that they were carrying with them. They didn't run in their slave clothes, you know, the croquet sacks bags that they gave people to wear. You know, croquet sacks they would put food in, corn sacks, rough clothing. No, men and women. And these ads describe them as having on pantaloons, the clothes that everybody else was wearing. And I kept thinking, what do they got on these clothes if they're going into the woods to look at the north? You know what I'm saying? They're dragging bags of clothes with them. And then the light bulb came on in my head when I was in Baltimore. Before I came down here to work, I worked in Baltimore. And I noticed, doing some other research, that the road that the people took, the free people going north, was the same road as the highway 83. Then I noticed that they said the people escaping from slavery would jump off the road into the woods during the day. They take the road at night. So two light bulbs came on. I said, okay, if you were a fugitive from so-called justice in America today, what would you do? Would you take out into the woods like some poor? That's why they put prisons out in the woods because they know the people who are in prison, most of them are urban people, and they come out in the woods, they're going to go back to the prison because they're scared. And the animals are going to kill them, they're not going to make it. So the enslaved people, really, instead of just striking out, you know, kind of desperate, almost an act of futility, having no plans at all, many of them clearly had plans, and their plans were to disguise themselves as free black people. Anyway, bless his heart. Ira Berlin did a groundbreaking book called Slaves Without Masters about free black people. But I believe he did us a disservice in this sense, is that he didn't capture or understand the reality of freedom for people who had been formerly enslaved and had bought their freedom from their enslavers, many of them, and especially in North Carolina. Unlike South Carolina, where the majority of the free black people were descendants of white masters, light-skinned, and had their own society. In North Carolina, that wasn't the case. In North Carolina, they were people who had either bought their freedom from former owners who were willing and open to them. They cheated them, of course, by making them work more than they needed to work. But they still had an identity with the enslaved. In South Carolina and other places, scholars have shown the free blacks, I'll say it again, who were light-skinned, mulatto, nothing about, I'm not a colorist, because I have light-skinned people in my family. So I'm not saying that to put them down, but they were able to form their own society, kind of a midway between white slave owners and enslaved. And they intermarried with one another, and they did not identify with the enslaved the same way free black people in North Carolina did. Many of them had family members who were still enslaved. Many of them bought enslaved people, like John Franklin had said, in order to protect them. And so there was an affinity that they maintained, a concern about the enslaved, a determination to help them escape, and to stay here themselves as long as they could because they owned land and they had family connections. I do want you to see the slides, however, because there's some interesting tidbits, I think, and stories in these slides and in other material that I've uncovered in the archives at Guilford College about the free black people. Well, they're my focus right now, focusing on the free black people in the Piedmont who helped enslaved people escape. And by this I mean going to Ohio or Indiana. Because the route from this part of the country is not through Pennsylvania. That was mainly on the waterways. The people who escaped from the east. They were first. But over time, they developed a route from the Piedmont north through what's now West Virginia. The map says Virginia, but it's now West Virginia, up through across the Ohio River, Highway 52 and Old Salisbury Road, and those were some of the routes, up into Ohio and Indiana, and then from there they were either conveyed to Canada or they stayed with free blacks in those two states. Okay, one of the things I want you to know about Guilford County is the increase in free black people over time. I didn't take this all the way to 1860, partially because of, well, anyway, I didn't want to overwhelm you with numbers because that can get a little tedious. But the point I want you to see is that although black people in this Guilford County, where I'm focused, I'm going to move on to Randolph County and others soon. But you can see that, unlike down east, black people were never a majority of the population in this area, or a near majority, more like 15, 20%. Now the thing about the census, you have to be careful because it undercounts. The census always undercounts. And especially free black people, they were undercounted there. So you can extrapolate from that, it's probably a larger number. But this is the bottom line, that the free black people were 20% of the total black population. That made disguising yourself as free, you see, feasible. Why am I running away with all these clothes? I mean, lots of clothes. One of the black conductors in Ohio, one woman had so many clothes, she was so bogged down with clothes she could carry, he had to ask her to leave. They had a big argument on the other side of, over in Kentucky, but she wouldn't leave the clothes. I thought, that humanizes people. You can see her down. She said, no, keep these clothes. He said, no, well, I got hours. He said, don't want us to get ready to break. We got to cross the river. But anyway, because these disguises, I feel, were so common, it's important to note that it was feasible because of the rising population of black people in Guilford County who were actually free. So it was, you could say I was free and you could be believed. If you couldn't be believed, why do it? The second thing I want you to see are these routes. Another factor I believe that made the Underground Railroad shift from the coast.
Can you make that a little bit bigger? Like on the
I'm trying, you know, I don't know how. Somebody knows how to do this. Yeah. Somebody knows how to do this.
You know how to do this.
I know how to get it. See, I don't know how to get it.
Escape. Push escape. Push escape.
I can leave home, but I'm gonna get back.
ESC at the top. I'll take you back.
I don't see anything.
ESC. Yeah, that's it.
Keep going. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Will it go keep going forward?
It'll take you back, but you can
I want
push.
to go forward.
If you push direction arrows, it should take you to the next slide.
We baby boomers, y'all been talking about age. I just want you to know I'm 75. We were beneficiaries of prosperity. Unlike our ancestors, we've had good medical care compared to our, you know.
Watch that cord. I don't want you to trigger. Okay.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I was falling dead in my house. I was falling even on ice. I grew up on ice in Ohio. Yeah, I didn't know how to fall and no fall. Thank you. I appreciate you. I appreciate your concern. Honestly, I'm not going to digress about this age business, but I am fascinated sometimes when people say, "Oh, you stay walking around." It's like white people, you know, when they used to say, "You can read." The internal slave trade became a big part of our country's history when the Louisiana Purchase opened up the land along the Mississippi River. You know, that's when the United States bought all that land from France, from Napoleon, in 1803, and opened up new lands. And so the plantation system did move west. And when the plantation system moved west to Alabama and Mississippi, especially Texas, Louisiana, they needed enslaved people to work the land. And so they didn't go to Africa to get most of them, they got them right here, from North Carolina, Virginia. And they started to sell people on the road. This road you see that comes through Salisbury, Old Salisbury Road, I believe it comes through Winston-Salem. I'm trying to find the actual road. People were shackled and walked hundreds of miles. And that plantation out of Stagville, which is one of the largest in North Carolina, had 900 enslaved people. He opened 2 plantations in Alabama, and those 600-mile walk from North Carolina to Alabama, they shackled people and walked them all that way. Some of them were taken by river. They had to go north to the Ohio River and cross to the Mississippi River and down to New Orleans. And those people are more talked about. However, the majority of them walked. They would walk over land in coffins, chained together most of the way. And this display of slavery in this county woke a lot of people up about what slavery was about. Because there was relatively not as many enslaved people in this part of North Carolina. And so slavery was kind of an abstraction. And many of the people who had enslaved people working for them, they only had a few. We didn't have the big plantations, except 84 was a big plantation. But otherwise, no. So many people saw this and were upset. But also many of the enslaved people who saw those victims being walked had compassion on them as well. Because some of them actually were free people who had been kidnapped. This is a long, detailed story. There's a lot of nuances in it. But I want you all to understand this internal slavery. You can see it going all the way by boat. This is a Smithsonian map, I believe, that shows you how intense it was and how it began to move slavery west. And as slavery moved west, so did the Underground Railroad. So did resistance. So there was always resistance. There was resistance from the beginning, from the 1500s. There was resistance. You know, I like the 1619 project I did too, but we need to wake up to the fact that North America, the United States history, is part of a wider history of the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish and Portuguese started the slave trade. The Spanish so-called owned Texas and California, New Mexico, and all that part of the country where the Latinos are coming back. Their ancestors were the Europeans who settled there. The English only had this side, on the other side of the Mississippi, originally. That's a part of our history they blot out. And by blotting it out, it also blots out a lot of African American history because we were a part of that as well. So that's the Benico and other Black explorers, as well as those down in Florida. They were there in the 15, I think they that 1619 project to the 1530 project, but I didn't want to get into that. This one came out in 1843. These are all from the Greensboro Patriot, which is what the News and Record was when it was first started, the Greensboro Patriot. And this man is one of those who was moving his enslaved people from Virginia to Alabama. I wanted you to see as an example what I'm talking about. He had 51 people, and he was walking from Virginia to Alabama. And they didn't have pavements back then. Now you understand what it meant to walk. You're on the dirt road, maybe shoes, maybe not, probably not, shackled and walking. And you can walk about 20 miles a day at a good pace. If you're a soldier, I think soldiers, Shaka walked his troops 50 miles a day. That's why people stop running. Yes, but the normal is 20. So you know how long that would take, at least a month of walk. Hard walk. So you can see that he also describes what he's got on. A black wool hat, cotton coat, shirt and pants and wallet. So he wasn't out there in rags, even though he was walking that long way. All right. This one is one of those, I went back to 1814. I got them from 1798. But this is before I found Professor Parker's work. Which I didn't know anybody's book, so I started going into the archive myself and taking these pictures off of the microfilm. Leonard Adelon was a Jewish slave owner in Greensboro. And he's also, I think his descendants own Yum Yum over at UNCG. I haven't had my courage up to go over there and talk to him yet. Now I got a colleague over there. You know, how would you feel if I knocked on your door? I heard your ancestors were slave owners. So I haven't done that. But this man describes the fact that in spite of the fact that you could be killed for learning to read and write, many enslaved people still learn to read and write. That's one about resistance. It was very common in these ads for them to say that they can read, he can read, or she can read and write. Some of the people just taught them because their conscience was pricked. Some people learned on their own. The read and write, you see what he's got going? And that laugh line, everybody laughs when they see that. They no more to run away, except to be free. Because they believe, many of the people who were slave owners, class get our heads in where their heads were. They really believed they were doing people a favor. They had rescued them from barbarity, from barbarism in Africa, rescued them, they said, from being eaten by the cannibals of Africa, and brought to this country, and slavery was benevolent, it was doing good. But you know that's not true. They did too, most of them. So, the full description, Emory actually was one of the first that the Quakers helped to escape to Indiana. He actually did escape, and he moved to Indiana and settled there and had a family there. This man we knew Conrad, I guess from our generation we call him Uncle Tom. But he was unapologetic about the fact that he was trying to survive. He was unapologetic about the fact that he was trying to survive. The class, let's come to class. Friends, this was time keep in your head. The penalties for helping people were severe. If you were free, you could lose your freedom. And if necessary, your life. It was called Negro stealing. It was like stealing horses. So in the courts, you would be accused of Negro stealing property, which is a death penalty. It's like stealing somebody's horses. Because they were considered the most valuable property in the South, or probably in the country, were labor. Next to land was labor. There were no machines to pick anything or plant anything or do any of that work that we don't know anything about, most of us, anymore. It was all done by hand. Without the field hands, it wasn't going to happen. And the Industrial Revolution was built on cotton, and cotton was built on slavery. It was slave labor or colonized people's labor in Egypt and India. One or the other. Produced cotton fueled the Industrial Revolution. That's why $50 in our terms would probably be about $5,000 today, of how much that would be. And this is for a man and wife. And instead of an example of Underground Railroad work, this is more of an example of the fact that many people did not leave the state, but they stayed in North Carolina. They found they were looking for family and friends, and they just disguised themselves as free and lived free as if they were free. But their motive was to reunite with family. The close ties of family are phenomenal. You can see it all through these ads how important family was to people and how hard it must have been to leave your family to go north. This one is one of those that I found that gave you a real connection with the Quakers in Guilford County. New Garden Settlement, the Deep River where the old hymnless Deep River, my home is over Jordan. Deep River, I want to cross over to campground. Deep River is the meeting that was in High Point. They're still there. And campground is Snow Camp, which is it was time for us to leave this to go on here, and many people were hidden in Deep River. Deep River meeting in High Point, and then they came through New Garden. The Quakers in New Garden and in Piedmont were staunchly anti-slavery. They were migrants from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, unlike the Quakers in the East. I don't want to talk down on the Quakers in the East. They came earlier, and they were almost all slave owners. The Quakers in the East had to be convinced to give up their property because they had depended on it for generations for their wealth. So it was a hard sell for them. But the Quakers in the Piedmont never owned slaves. They were anti-slavery, bringing that idea from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. So that became kind of good. Even Guilford College's first superintendents were involved. Yes, ma'am.
So the ones in Guilford County were the ones who owned slaves for safety? Because
Yes.
some owned them. Could you share with them?
Oh, yes. In fact, I got a picture of the Mendenhall plantation. Exactly. The Mendenhalls were slave owners. They were Quakers in Guilford County who refused to give up owning slaves. But they said, I think, there's a lot of evidence they're telling the truth, that they were training those people to be independent. They put them in charge of the whole operation. And then, when they felt they were ready, or they felt they were ready, they took them to Indiana on some false bottom wagons, some not. They just pretended to give them papers. But they took them. I visited there many times, kept questioning them the best you can, about what was really going on here. They even have a building where they had a school where they were teaching their enslaved people undercover. In one daytime it was this open school for everybody, but they said that later in the evening they would have the enslaved people there and they would teach them. And they did run the store. I did find that out even from the tax records, that they ran the store, they did the business part. And so they said, we're not going to do this manumission because we can protect people better here than we manumission. So they did both. I think they were halfway exploiting them, using them as all business people do, exploit their labor, and halfway helping. They were doing a little of each. That's a good question, though. And I'll say I've got a picture of the plantation coming, yes. And they tried, the New Garden Friends, there's so much pressure on them, they would just read you out of membership. So they had a real problem with George Mendenhall because he was awful wealthy. And he didn't care. I said, put me like a modern day term, right you out of the church, put me out. Because I got my money and I got my faith and I know what I'm doing. Okay, so anyway, this one led to a case. And there was a woman named Susan Hubbard in Deep River, at the Deep River meeting. I won't read you the letter. It's a long letter that's in the Guilford College archives, in which she wrote this letter to her friends in Snow Campground, telling them that she was upset because her father had been caught up in this case where he was accused of helping a fugitive slave to escape. She claimed that her father and the Swains were the owners of the Guilford newspaper, the Manumission Society people. They were prominent people. The Clarks and the Stanleys, who were akin to the Quakers that founded Guilford College. And they were all going to go on trial for helping this man escape. She said that Richard Ladd, who was a free black man in the community, who was discovered by research, he also was a person who was an honest person. Her father, you had to have somebody, instead of a marriage license, you had to have a bonds person to stand for your wedding. To say that you were qualified to get married, countersigned papers for you instead of marriage license. Her father had been Richard Ladd's. He had stood for him for the marriage of Richard Ladd to Brian Curry's daughter. These were free black people. So it's interaction between white people, Quakers especially, and free blacks. I think that made this network work. I think all the networks, even among just the black people alone, the based on relationships, family relationships. That's first. And out of those relationships come the activism. And this is Joseph and Abigail Stanley, who were the, I know he looks like a stern gentleman there with that crooked eye. I gave I noticed that. He's got a what's called eye, lazy eye.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's Nathan Hunt's daughter. Nathan Hunt was the founder of Guilford College. And so she's married to Stanley. Stanley's in the case. Dugan Clark's in the case. They're all accused. And her father left Guilford College. She said he sold the property. He sold everything. He's gone to Indiana. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go too, because we're afraid that father's going to be, probably not killed, at least lose everything if he doesn't leave. Stanley was involved, as well as Dugan Clark. But the most significant for me, well, this is a picture of Guilford College. I don't know if you care, but it looks the same to me. But it's on the side, we got a road that is paved. That's Founders Hall. The person I want to end this with you is Lavina Curry. She was a free black woman who worked as the first washerwoman at the boarding school. She was called a washerwoman. So she did the laundry, she probably cleaned up after the kids in the dormitories, whatever. And she lived on the campus. Her husband, Archibald Curry, the coffins called him Arch. Archibald Curry and Vina Curry are in the census 1820 in Robeson County, which is south of this place, going down toward the beach, on the beach road. They came from Moore County to Robeson County as free black people. Then they moved from there to Guilford County in the 1830s. And Archibald Curry bought land from Quakers out near Horsepen Creek Road. I think they probably ripped it off. I looked at the price, it was probably, but it's okay. At least they sold him the land. He, among other free black people in this area, owned a substantial amount of land before slavery was over. And so he had that security. When he died, apparently she didn't inherit it. He had sold the land for whatever reason. So she moved on to the campus. And Addison Coffin says in his memoir that she gave her dead husband Archibald's 3 papers to fugitives who were going north, so they could use them to disguise themselves as free. And when they got to Indiana, the fugitives would give the papers to Levi Coffin, who was well known as part of the Underground Railroad. He would send them back. He said they did it about 11 times. Levi Coffin said innumerable times. This was a common. Levi Coffin said this was a common way that people escaped from slavery. And I'm going to propose to you that this defies stereotypes about black people. This is one of the reasons why even we as black people don't seem sometimes to really grasp what's going on when we have the stereotypes. Like it's all brain, all brawn and no brains. It's all kind of instinct. Looking at stars have got to be intelligent. But this took planning. This required ingenuity, right? This is like all the other fugitives. I'm saying out on the road. You out on the road just like the other fugitives. Common sense. To me, it's common sense. More common sense to do that than to strike out at night. You don't know where you're going, right? No food, no clue about anything. This is the way it has been portrayed for various reasons I won't get into, psychological reasons. Somehow black people have these instincts that other people don't have. But that's not true. Or this physical strength that other people don't have. And that's not true either. So I just tell my students, that Cuba was, most of the slaves in Cuba, most of the work was done by white people. That's Cuba's an island, it's hot, right? Anyway, what happened to them as a result was that the New Garden Friends meeting passed a resolution. And they said that we want to make the world know that we, the Friends, do not agree with this Underground Railroad activity. This is a part of a minute that I found in the archives. 1843, New Garden Friends said, we want everybody to know that we do not sanction any illegal activities. We are against slavery, true, but this harboring people who are running away, we don't sanction any of that. We're not behind any of that. We want to make sure we do not interfere with the system of slavery, they said, further than by petition only. 1843. So the Quakers who decided they were going to continue this activity had to do so in defiance of their church. So I want to make that clear. It wasn't that the Quakers as a church or as a group, as a body, officially sanctioned the Underground Railroad. They did not. But individuals were willing to step out against and even go against the tide in their own church, in their own community. And it led to a split in the Quakers in Indiana. And as I get closer to the final, I'm almost there. Here's another one that says you pass. This one talks about the light skin color of this person. But in fact, that was also a stereotype. It was an acronym. Last one, I promise you. I'm not going to like this week. She said, I will be before you for, if I know the church I'm talking about. Oh yeah. This is the last time. I only got one more scripture. The next thing you know, it's another last time. But this really is. 1850 is the last ad I'm going to show you. I thought you'd be interested in the fact that he calls this 49-year-old man a boy, his boy, who has free papers, as in probably in the company of others, of the free blacks or abolitionists. And the key to this, what I used to argue with other historians about, is the Underground Railroad, its importance was not the numbers of people who ran away. It could be 100,000, it could be 40,000, but the fact that there was organized resistance, this was the key to its significance. Organized, persistent resistance. And said that he's probably even been freed, helped by abolitionists, and it goes on to say, this Mebane, I think it's the same Mebane that Mebane is named for. I'm trying to see if it's the same man. He's a doctor, very wealthy man, rich man by any standards. I think it might be the same one. But anyway, he said, we shouldn't let any Negroes get out of here, travel, without being carefully scrutinized. Be they free or not, we don't know. Strict scrutiny. This is because some of them are being carried off, and this is where the mendenhall come into play. But I think what they're doing is not telling the whole truth up at the plantation. This is the Mendenhall plantation in Jamestown. I recommend you all go visit sometime. It's in Jamestown, right at the end of Guilford College Road. Where Guilford College Road ends up, the dead is in Jamestown. Okay, there it is. And inside it, they have this wagon. This is, when I saw this wagon, I was flabbergasted. You mean to tell me, because I'm from Ohio, I've driven that highway since the 70s. And I thought there's no way you can get across those mountains. No. On a wagon like this, the wheels are rusted, but they are metal wheels. There's no cushion in anything. And they had two teenage boys. They thought that they could disguise them easily because they were too young to be suspicious. So two teenage boys drove this wagon. It's been authenticated now, it's true. They drove this wagon. Listen, if you go back in the day, everything they had was an art standard. You would just fall out. You couldn't imagine riding on conveyances that they rode that they thought was luxury. So this you see at the top is where they had the hay or the corn. And underneath, show better, this is I took these pictures myself. So this is where they hid, they said 8 people would have to lay on their side. You know, like on the side, on top, they would leave the produce. This, again, reinforces my idea. They couldn't possibly have ridden all that way like that. It's not possible. They didn't. In fact, the truth is that they hid when they were in a danger area. Okay. That's how it worked. But then people writing about people who have written about were talked about, those collections about how they escaped. They talked about getting in when there was danger. They were getting to a dangerous area. Sometimes people along the way would warn them. You know, there's patrollers out here, but they had different signal songs to let you know the patrollers were near. They'd get in the wagon and cover it up, was already covered, and keep going. But usually they had to walk most of the way. They walked beside the wagon because you were suffocating there. You know, this is not a riding in the car to Ohio. Okay, this is like a month or so to get where you're going because they couldn't make much time. And I wanted you all to see that again, just to reinforce the fact that yes, there were hardships. Yes, people didn't name their lives. Yes, only a minority actually made it. It was an arduous journey, but it was a diverse number of people helping. There were Native Americans. I didn't bring them all in. There were Native Americans who helped. There were white people and black people who were paid. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They were paid to help. Some of them told the black people who were patrollers, who helped, you know, to catch people and send them back. Just like there were Africans in the motherland who helped, who raided villages and took people out and so for the business. And so people say, how could Africans do this? They own people in the slave. I said, because they want their own people. Somebody asked me that at a conference one time. I got annoyed with her. I should have been kinder to her. I'm trying. As I get old, I'm trying to get more mellow. I'm trying to mellow out. No, you did the right thing. But I asked her, have you ever asked anybody how white people were killed other white people in World War II? No. You didn't cross your mind, right? You can ask a question like that. Because you understand that there's a diversity of all the people. And in Africa, there's diversity, as there still is, and always has been, of people, different interests, and different values, and different perspectives on life. But still, injustice is not colored. There's injustice, I believe, in the heart of everyone. The potential for doing bad is in all of our hearts. We just are in a situation to be tested. I don't want to be tested either. But the ability to resist, I'm going to sit down and say this. The ability to resist depends in large part on with whom you identify. You know, do you see yourself as potentially, as the free black people in this community here apparently did understand that their freedom was very tenuous. And as long as slavery existed, their freedom was, as I said, on shaky ground. As long as, even though in this community, in Piedmont especially, the laws were not enforced. It was against the law. When you were free in North Carolina, that's where our Berlin, I think, threw people off. Even though you were supposed to be forced to leave when you were free, they didn't. In fact, free black people were pouring into North Carolina from Virginia after North Carolina passed this law that outlawed free black people to stay in North Carolina. Thousands of them moved here, anyway, and they didn't get arrested, they didn't get thrown out. There's even an example of a white woman who was married to a black man. I think the man was a slave, and they recognized, no, one of them was a black man who was married to a white woman. They had to pay a penalty for being married. It was against the law, but it happened. So what did the law do? They said, okay, we're just going to charge you a fine. So you had to pay a tax on your marriage. But the marriage was recognized. So in many cases, there was even a case of a slave man who took a white man to court. And they heard the case. So sometimes, you know, when you get down in the weeds, you find things that you didn't know existed if you stay up here making generalizations. But really to understand our history, I believe we have to get into the weeds and really dig in there and see how diverse and different things could be in the same place. So thank you.
As we begin to wind down, I'll say a couple words because that's the story we do. When we hear stuff we want to chime in, but we learn to wait we'll say some things and hopefully she nods her head about what I'm saying. The complexities, right? The expressions of humanity in those journeys, the idea that this person didn't have to, but they did something that was outside of themselves because they recognized something needed to be done. The chances that are taken, I actually taught, of course, this semester that I got to create myself on slave resistance. And that resistance shows itself in many ways. So every week in my discussion board, or whatever I imparted that week, the question would always be, how did you see resistance this week? Or what did you notice that was something along the lines of resistance? And it didn't have to be violent. It could be labor related. You work a little slower. Take breaks. It could be clothing related. Take something from the mistress. You take something from the master. Use it for your own purposes. Two individuals that I taught on this past semester were William and Ellen Pratt. They escaped slavery because she was fair-skinned, mulatto, as they said back in that period of time, and she posed as the owner of her husband as they traversed the South to make their escape north. Using clothing. She dressed as a man. He remained dressed as a servant, but they carried forth with her acting like a white man so that her and her husband could escape slavery. I taught about Margaret Garner, who murdered her child, a couple of her children, on her first escape, was recaptured, and she was attempting to kill herself. No, I think she killed her children on the second escape. She was returned to slavery after her first attempt with her children. Then on her second attempt, when she was caught again, because as you can see, they went looking. They did not just allow for their property to escape. And you think about the psychological element that we just mentioned in terms of the malaise that they thought the slave was experiencing. They thought they were doing some good. They were like, well, something's wrong with them because they want to get away and be free. You gotta go fix that. And there's this perverse endearment that takes place in terms of, I have to have that person. George Washington was one of those people. Wrote a letter about one of his enslaved. I think her name was Margaret also. I have to find him. I'm going to look for him. I'm going to spend capital to go find a human being that I consider proper. But I have to have him for whatever reason. So anyway, Margaret Garner, she didn't want her children to experience slavery. So she killed them. And then she eventually committed suicide herself. But this stuff, on the base level, is not talked about or understood and contextualized in the way that it should be for us to be better. And that's part of what I hopefully desire to steer RELC towards more of this. I will stay and remain centering and focused on the Black American experience for as long as I deem necessary, as long as I'm in this role, because that's the roots. It's not to be exclusive or exclusionary. There's much more to be included in terms of racial dynamics and the equity that we must discuss. There just is. The conversation will go on. But if we get this part completely understood, completely contextualized, and we function from that area, then the rest of it makes total sense. It does not become, we have to wait and learn some more, we have to wait. No, the Black American experience is the one to start with.
Dr. Boucher?
Yes, I appreciate you calling me out.
Can I just suggest, I was just going to suggest this to you all. I discovered, looking at the ads on my own, many ads for white bondsmen, indentured servants. We were taught wrongly. It was absolutely false in high school that the indentured white people, that disappeared, like, like the American Revolution or something. Here I found these ads in the 1850s for indentured servants who were white. And I think, I agree with you in one sense, as African Americans, it's true, our history has been totally suppressed. But the whole history has been so mistaught. They have just eliminated, I mean, in school, I thought I had a good education in school. They taught us something wasn't true. Here it is, the ads for the indentured servants. They were, as far as, they were enslaved, but they were treated similarly by their so-called owners until they worked out, sometimes it was 18 years from childhood they were kept. And I think that we have a truncated vision of what America's history has really been about.
Absolutely. I do not dispute or disagree with that, and there are always going to be instances, there are instances of Native Americans owning slavery. The whole notion is something that I give as an example to my students that I definitely wanted to mention. I'm glad you kind of spurred it back up. When people think of why didn't black people resist it, man, how could they do that to their own people, what she was mentioning a moment ago? Again, Africa's a continent, right? So the example I give to my students is, imagine being awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning and thrown into a holding space or place, and then placed on some type of transport vessel. Could be a bus at this point. Could be with only your neighborhood, 3-block, 4-block radius, just the people in your neighborhood. Are you going to just all rise up and understand what's happening and find some alignment? And you're going to run into people that don't speak English in that 3-block radius. You're going to run into people who have their best interests at heart above yours, who are going to make sense of it and say, this is something, I know I'm going to talk to these people. I'm going to make sure that me and my 2 friends are good, but we'll tell them, hey, you know, we don't like this person, that person. But you don't know that. That's in a 3-block radius. Imagine a continent getting raided, a country, different tribes, different languages, different dialects, what we've already said, on a grand level, and you're filling up the whole bottom of the ship in chain. How are you going to find some type of alignment to overthrow everything? Yeah, 10 Europeans could control the ship because you don't know what the heck is happening. And the person next to you might not even speak your language. They might have been your enemy. They might be somebody you was fighting last week. And you're supposed to just make up, be friends. Then you don't even know where you're headed. And there's documentation that says a lot of those Africans thought that the white men were cannibals, taking them somewhere to eat them. But they were saving those people from cannibals in Africa. Come on. So it's very deep, it's very layered, there's a lot more to it. Any questions, thoughts?
I do have an injection. On June the 11th in Charleston at Sullivan's Island, every second Saturday in June, we do a remembrance to our ancestors, and we have a full ceremony with libations. It starts at 9 a.m. and we're usually out there by 1:30. But I was thinking too about the form of resistance. A lot of people, and I know students were always surprised when I would share that there were many Africans who drowned themselves, whole families, and particularly from royal households, to prevent becoming enslaved. So, and we have a Toni Morrison bench. Toni Morrison came to Charleston, and she celebrated with us a few years, and then we did a bench, so we have that at Sullivan's Island too. But we do historical encounters, and then we take the march out to the ocean, and we share fruits, vegetations, and flowers. And I just wanted to share that.
Thank you for sharing that. I know you guys can't wait to get to Charleston pretty soon. Really quickly, to your point, there's plenty of literature, there's plenty of things that you can, I don't know what you're doing, but there's plenty of things that you can explore somebody, I hope you got somebody. Yeah. There's plenty of stuff that you can explore to actually just provide total context to some of the things we've been discussed. Olabu Equianis has he was a enslaved individual who was kidnapped as part of Africa. His story is amazing, but one of the things that he talks about is the suicide that was committed by people on the slave ships. There's actually arguments in historical literature of sharks following slave ships because they knew a meal was coming at some point. Whether that person jumped intentionally or whether they were thrown overboard because they were sick and they wanted to get rid of it, or they were troublesome. Well, Bernard, you have a comment?
So I know, Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, from what I've read, had white farmers. And I think it's interesting that they were as bold as they were in doing some of the things and being part of the resistance that you spoke about. To what degree do you think that them having white lineage gave them either a personal confidence or maybe a more engaged belief that they could get things on the finish line that maybe other Africans or Black Americans didn't make happen?
That's a hard question. I think the best way to answer it, I have to tap into my memory, which I must admit, it's been a long time since I read their autobiography.
And I just read them that like last summer, so it's kind of fresh on my mind, and I was struck at how bold they seem to be. You know, when Frederick Douglass got in a fight with his owner, and then how Booker T spoke to the Atlanta Congress, and he was just so bold in some of the things that
He was not very bold in that speech. His Atlanta compromise, he was telling people black folks we could cast down their buttons.
Well, let me
They have to be correct.
give you my best answer. My best answer. Okay. Harriet Tubman was totally African, with no heritage outside of being an African. So well as Sojourner Truth and many others. But it could be, very well could be, that somehow in their upbringing, they were exposed to things, or they had a sense of resentment, you know, that you have this father. You know, I think psychology historians could better articulate than I can. They could very well have felt a kind of resentment against their fathers, or being fathered by someone who doesn't recognize you, you know, who has completely ostracized you, has sold you, you know, could create a kind of emotional determination to get back at them. That other, you know, that you're not really part of the community like others have been. But I wouldn't take it too far, because we don't know enough. Sometimes the people who become our leaders, so-called leaders, are anointed by the other side. And they're not necessarily, I would be interested, I would really interested to know in how the Africans, the enslaved people felt about Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
And how the common people, so to speak, about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, because the man who had the greatest following of all time in history was Marcus Garvey.
Yes.
And
So
Mr. Maker.
so you have to be really
So to that point, I'll say this, and I thoroughly enjoy speaking with this guy, so I can just start talking. But the critical thing to keep in mind, education generally played a significant role in those who decided to do the ultimate things in terms of freedom. The things that the Nat Turner, he could read. DeMar Vest, he was a free man. He generally was associated with understanding what it was to be somewhat enfranchised in society. Frederick Douglass fighting overseer, that happened more than you would even remotely believe. He just happens to escape and tell his story. Booker T. Washington, another thing I would challenge to a degree, who's to say that their fathers were white? That actually can afford you something.
His mother told him.
Well, I'm just saying. I'm saying to the point that it's proven.
That's about it. Mom said that.
The grandmother spent more time than his mother. But all that being said,
I'm sorry.
who was it?
I'm sorry.
No. Booker T. Washington. Was it? Yeah, was it a white man that was a servant that was his father?
Listen, John Parker, who wrote his autobiography, he's the only one I know who wrote his autobiography. John Parker was a black man who was a conductor on Underground Railroad in Whitfield, Ohio. Great man. He said that he felt he got his ability or willingness to rebel from his white father. And now it's my humble opinion, very humble, I can't wrap it up. Although my sister, I agree with her, we were not slaves, but we do have, and we still have a slave mentality.
Yes. Program.
And the mindset, you
Take
know,
something from
that
it.
we have this mindset, and I have wondered myself, you know, Thurgood Marshall looked like a white man. And so many leaders, black
Yes.
leaders.
Advocate back.
Yes. And I wondered myself, if there isn't something to that brainwashing.
Exactly. That's, so when you can say, I'm associated with this group of people by some measure, and that gives me value that's inherent, you're playing along with what I
Well,
was
I
going to say.
believe- That's why I know, that's why I haven't looked up, not to be too personal, but I have a whole segment of my family in Ohio that's passing for white.
There you go.
No way am I gonna, oh,
And you just reminded me.
I feel like if they want to go over there and do that, fine. But I'm definitely not yearning to find them. That's why I haven't done my DNA and my. I don't want to find them. I'm not saying anything wrong with it, but I'm just saying if they disowned us, why should we be running around trying to get connected?
One of the historians that you mentioned earlier, Ira Berlin's work, Slave God Masters. I actually took a course last semester, Dr. Militier. Are you familiar with his work? So Dr. Militier literally says exactly what she just said. He's a fairly young scholar, but he condemned a lot of Ira Berlin in the same manner as Dr. Israel did in her conversation. Not as this is a completely waste of time, but this was a older white guy who did all this research. It's going to have a skew to it. Like, how do you not consider this, this, and this? And that's what a lot of current scholars are wrestling with when it comes to